a little early because we have a lot of announcements. So thank you guys all for your prompt arrival here at the Beaches Museum Chapel. Is this anyone's first time to the chapel? Welcome. Oh, that is a great job. That's a great show of hands. Welcome. Hopefully it's not your last. Raise your hands again. All my regulars, make a new friend. Make sure you invite them back to the next event. Welcome back. That's cool. Our very recently departed museum operations manager, by the way, I have an open position. Operations manager, if anyone is interested. I want to recognize first, we have a few board members here. We have Katie Lemaster. Yes, applause are appropriate. They work very hard. Doris McNeil. Yay. Board President Jack Schmidt. Oh, good. I don't think I missed anybody, but thank you guys for being here and for your leadership. We appreciate you so much. Do we have any museum members? Museum members, awesome. Thank you so much for your support. If you would like to become a museum member, it's one of our most reliable annual ways to support the museum. Katie Lemaster, in addition to being our vice president, is also our membership chair. And Doris McNeil is on that committee, so they're strategically placed throughout the audience, so please feel free to find them. Really important question that is on everyone who's new, for you first timers. The bathrooms are not in the chapel. Don't see them. They are across the way. Just go across the patio and follow the sign that says restrooms up into the cabin. They are not the original restrooms. We've equipped them with fully modern, handicap accessible restrooms. Thank you to fundraising guru Jack Schmidt. We were able to do that. But please avail yourself of the facilities at any point. We have a lot of upcoming events, and I will say I'm so glad to see so many people here today because we're really just kind of getting back into the swing of things. I forgot. I'm supposed to be monitoring this. We're also on Zoom, and we are recording this. So hi, Zoomers. They can only see them. Yes, Zoomers. But we do have a couple upcoming events that I wanted to mention. And most importantly, I wanted to mention that one thing that COVID did for us that was a good thing is that we now require pre-registration for everything. We used to just kind of hope for the best, and we never really knew how many people were going to show up at anything. But we decided to get a little smarter about that. So, and there's Marta Polly, another board member. She's like, what did I do? Welcome. So please keep an eye out. If you see an event that you want to go to, please make sure to pre-register so that we can just kind of get into that good habit. For members, admission to these events are free, and for non-members, we ask for a $5 optional donation. A couple other, what did I write? Oh, our next two Boardwalk talks are actually going to be at the Beaches Museum, and they are very limited seating because we're going to be in the Dickinson Gallery next month with Dr. Keith Ashley and Dr. Denise Bosey. Come on in. What do you mean? Sorry. You're not. They're going to be talking about the Our Land Indigenous Northeast Florida. That is an exhibit that was put up and was scheduled to open in March of 2020, and we all know what happened in March 2020. So they're going to do a little talk and then a walking tour through the exhibit. So you lucky ones who already signed up, congratulations. It is now sold out, but we do have a wait list started. And then after that, in April, we're going to have Brittany Cohill come and talk about Manhattan Beach, and we're going to have her. We have a traveling exhibit about Manhattan Beach. It's going to be set up in the lobby. That thing's traveled so many places. It's been to Hannah Park, it's been to Atlantic Beach, it's been to Rhoda Martin Center. It's at JU right now, but it's never been at the Beaches Museum. So we're finally going to have it at the museum. We're very excited about that. Spring in the Blooms is the same weekend as Spring in the Blues. See what we did there? It's a great event celebrating nature gardens. It's really led by our master gardeners. It's going to be the morning of April 2nd. And we're very excited. Fletcher Senators in the room. All right, go Senators. You don't have to be a senator to attend the Fletcher All-Class Block Party. It helps that you at least maybe know and like some senators, because that's really the predominant guest list that's going to be there. So the Fletcher All-Class Block Party, after a 2-year hiatus, is going to be back. It's out in the park on April 30th. And what's going to be really fun about that is it's also the kickoff of our Fletcher history exhibit. Fletcher High School is turning 85. So it's very exciting. So we're going to start that on April 30th. ended on September 20th, which is the actual birthday of the school. I missed anything? Deb, am I missing anything? So I'm really excited to welcome Bill Delaney, and not only because he can pack a house, but because he just brings such a depth of knowledge about history and culture and some exciting things that have happened around the First Coast. He's a writer, editor, and higher education professional, and he's the co-owner and editor of, and you'll hear more about this, Modern Cities, the JacksonMag.com, Edible Northeast Florida. And if you don't, does anybody follow the Jackson on Facebook? And it's a partnership with WJCT, and I'll tell you, if you're on social media or any public radio listeners out there, I thought there might be a few, follow them. It's so interesting, and they do such a great job tying in some of our local history with current events and things that are going on with development and things like that going on around town. So they really do a good job tying things together in a really interesting way. So when his book came out, we were really excited to sell it in the wonderful gift shop that we have down at the Beaches Museum. And we hope that you will enjoy his talk tonight about Secret Jacks. All yours.
All right, everybody hear me all right?
Yay!
All right, great. Thank you so much for the introduction, Chris. Move on, if I can work this thing.
You guys all saw it work. Okay.
Okay, it does work. All right, yeah. So my name is Bill Delaney. I'm a local writer. I am a Beaches native. I grew up in Neptune Beach, in the house that my mom also grew up in. It's been in our family since the 1940s. It's very exciting for me to be here and be able to talk to all of y'all. Tell a little bit about my book, Secret Jacksonville. My publisher, Reading Press, does these books in different cities, and they wanted to do one in Jacksonville that was on the weird, wonderful, and obscure. And so when they called me up, I really jumped at the chance to do that, because that's exactly the stuff that I like to write and research. I look for that stuff, even if I wasn't writing a book. So I really jumped at the chance to do it. And it was a great opportunity to learn more about the city. You know, I've been writing about it for a number of years now, and I still am finding things that I had no idea existed. You'll hear about a couple of them tonight, things that are relatively new to me. But the book contains 86 different chapters on different spots and spaces across the city that have some kind of a hidden secret or an unusual facet, or sometimes it's just a cool place to visit that I think needs to get more attention. Now, I'm not going to be able to get through all 86 of them tonight now, or as much as I would like to, so we're just going to do a couple of them. But one thing I like to do when I come out to do these talks at different places is, my stories are all over the city. They're all, it was very important to me to try to pick things that was a wide thread, going all the way from Cumberland Island, all the way down to Marineland and everything in between. And it was very important for me to try to get a wide array of stories. That means is that when I come to a neighborhood like this, I can kind of form my talk based on a couple of stories that are around there. So what we're going to do is go through a few stories from my book, one that's not, that have to do with the beaches to start, and then we'll kind of start to spread out as we go. So to give you a sense of how I got interested in this stuff, I want to tell you a ghost story. So I grew up in Neptune Beach. This is not my house, by the way. I'm on Bull Street, which is kind of cut off by the picture. This is the best I can do. But my first exposure to the concept of folklore and studying it and learning more about cool and unusual things and just weird, crazy stories came when I was a little kid. When I grew up in the 80s and 90s, we had a haunted house in our neighborhood, like a number of neighborhoods do. It was this one. It's there on Strand Street, right on the ocean, corner of, I believe it's Oleander. And it stood out as a haunted house. I think there's a couple of reasons why. One is it's kind of this big imposing building, there's no windows on the side. It doesn't look like anything else that's around it. It kind of stands out, but more than that, it was owned by people that, clearly it was owned by some townies or out-of-towners that weren't there a lot, so we never saw them. Or if we did see them, we didn't ever remember it. So we thought the house was abandoned, and that really set up the story. There's a story that there was a woman that was murdered there, and she was buried underneath a tree that inexplicably was growing an atrium in the house, even though you couldn't see any atrium from the outside. We had no idea how this tree was supposed to have gotten light. But what we would do is we would challenge each other to go up and ring the doorbell and try to stand there as long as you could before you freaked out and ran away. As I got older and started looking into folklore more, more professionally, I guess, there's a term for that. It's called legend tripping, and it's just what it sounds like. It's the idea that you test your metal. It's generally young people test their metal or get initiated into the group, or just scare themselves silly for a good time by going to a place that is attributed with some kind of frightening legend. So ours was that house. Well, I'm sad to report that eventually the house changed ownership, and the new owners were there. They lived there full time, and it just wasn't the same. When you go trying to do a haunted house and you see mom out there pumping up the bike tires, dad was off the boogie board, it just isn't scary anymore. So I remember talking to my mom, who grew up in the same house that I did, in the same neighborhood, and saying how disappointed I was that people had bought this house and were actually living there because it was the haunted house. And she told me that when she was growing up, she also knew about the haunted house, except it was a totally different house. It was this one. A block away on, I believe it's Strand and Old. I know, that one's on Strand and Laura, maybe. Unfortunately, I cut out the names of the streets. You can tell exactly which ones they are. But it was the same concept. She said that it was kind of an older house at that time. It stood out. There was a lot fewer of these other houses that were built nearby it. So it stood out, and they never saw the people who were there. So they also would go scare themselves silly by ringing the doorbell and inside and all the things that kids do. And so that really jumped out at me that, like, wow, we have a ghost story here that has such longevity in our neighborhood that it survives the houses not being scary. But not even in there. In the early 2000s, when my little brother was growing up, he's a good bit younger than me, I used to tell him all the things that I knew. And of course, one of the very first things that I'm going to tell him when he gets old enough is about the haunted house. And so I take him to the one that I knew about. And I tell him the stories, and he's not that impressed because, again, you see dad out there, washing the car. It's not very scary at all. But next door to that house was a house that he found to be very scary. This one. He saw that at that time. It's been totally remodeled, unfortunately, but at that time, it was kind of an aging house. It had these big bushes all around it, so it was really obscured from the street. And there was somebody living there, but we never saw him. We would just see the car drive up and quickly go into the garage, and the door would shut. And so we started saying that it was a haint that lived there. Haint is it's an old Southern term for ghost. You might know the term from To Kill a Mockingbird. It's what gravity was said to be, was a haint. And so, sure enough, a few weeks later, I'm out there, my brother has some of his friends over, and he's showing them around, and he starts saying that the haunted house is that one. Tells them the same stories, but he said, but a totally different house. That's at least the third house that this ghost has been in. This ghost is really a trooper. I'm sad to say that house has been remodeled, doesn't look scary at all. I like to think that maybe there's a fourth house that is still out there in the neighborhood. The kids and growing up around Strand Street, now think is haunted. I have not heard if there is one, but it was one of those things that really taught me from a very early age how badly people value feeling connected to the place they live and to history, you know, to the past of where they live, even when it's not a real past. You know, there never was a murder in all 4 of those houses, you know. But we wanted to feel like we were part of something. And I think that's something that you're going to see in some of the later stories that we cover. That's a consistent thing that comes up. Going to the next one. I keep forgetting which place to point this. So the story that some of y'all are likely to be familiar with, the story of Rebo's column. So I like to say that Jacksonville's history doesn't begin 200 years ago when the city was founded. It doesn't begin back in 1776 when the country was founded. It doesn't even begin when the first Europeans got here 460 years ago. Our real history, our human history, goes back 14,000 years to when the first people came to our area. Now, we're not going to go quite back that far in this story, but we are going to go pretty far, back to the French colonization of our area. So this is the column there, left by Jean Ribaud, a French explorer, in 1562. He was a Huguenot, a form of Protestantism. At the time of the French Wars of Religion, it was still a war between Protestants and Catholics. Ribaud's mission was to try to find and settle a haven for the Huguenots in the New World. So he explored the southeastern U.S., and he came to our area. It was the first well-documented trip that ever came to our area. He stopped at the mouth of St. John's River. He interacted with the local Macomb group of people that lived there. And one thing that he did was he placed that column somewhere in Mayport or very close by to Mayport as a marker that this land belonged to France. It's emblazoned with the French coat of arms, the fleur-de-lis. And he left it there. He didn't stay. He went up to South Carolina. He left another column up there. And then he sailed on for reinforcements. Unfortunately for him, when he got back to Europe, he was arrested in England. So the French had to send his lieutenant, Delaney de Laudonnière, came back. He went back in the first place that his boss had gone to. We went back to the Jacksonville area, went back to the mouth of the St. John's River, and he met the Timucua people again, the Macomb Timucua who lived here. At this point, the column was still there. It's known from this engraving that's said to have been by somebody who would have seen it. The image there depicts a Timucua king named Adore, showing the column to Laudonnière. And so, you know, Laudonnière reports that the Indians had turned it into kind of a shrine. You know, he's very likely to be misrepresenting what he saw, but he still saw that it was seen as an important spot for the people who lived around there. Well, long story short, Fort Caroline, the colony that he founded, didn't last very long. The next year, in 1565, John Ribaud showed back up, finally getting out of jail and bringing reinforcements, but he has terrible news. The French, the Spanish are on their way. They've claimed they have a priority claim to Florida, and they're going to eject the French. Ribaud's fleet is then wrecked in a hurricane. The Spanish carry the day, and they massacre most of the French that they find. The Fort Caroline itself was later burned down, but the column is not clear what happened to it. There's Spanish records that say they went to Paris Island, South Carolina. They found and destroyed that one. But there's no record of what happened to the one that was in Mayport. Well, we might know now. In 2015, a group of maritime salvagers found a shipwreck off the coast of Cape Canaveral. It goes back to the 1500s, so it's the right era, and it had on it a bunch of bronze cannons with the fleur-de-lis on it, and it had a marble column just like that one. So it stands to reason, it's thought to be that this is Jean Ribaud's main ship, La Trinité, and that this is either the column that Ribaud originally left there in 1562, or it was another one that he was planning on putting somewhere else. But either way, it's pretty cool. Now that it's been found, there's a good chance that we might actually be able to display it here in Jacksonville, where it originally stood at some point in the future. The common story doesn't even end with that. This is a way that people try to be, it's one of those things that speaks to how much people want to be tied to their area and to the history of their area. In 1924, the Daughters of the American Revolution commissioned a replica of the original column in order to celebrate the discovery of, or the settlement, the French settlement here. Originally stood pretty close to where the original would have been on Mayport. There's pictures of where it was, kind of up on a hill in its own little dedicated area. However, in 1940, when the Navy came to town, they took over most of Mayport, other than the Mayport Village, which is the part, the non-Navy based part that's still there. So Naval Station Mayport, they take over the land and they move the column. Unfortunately, they move it into the middle of Mayport Road. Just waiting to be hit by a car. So in 1958, the local folks decided that was the best place for it. They moved this replica column over to the Movement Preserve in 1958. It has its own little dedicated riverfront spot. It looks like the original one, a little bit west from where we are. So not at the beaches, but essentially right across the intercoastal from where we are. But it's I think even more than a celebration of of what happened. It's really taking the artistic record of the very first Europeans to be in our area and making something new and different out of it. And I think that's pretty cool. Now my next story, this one is exclusive content, y'all. This one isn't actually in my book. I briefly mentioned it, but it's a story that I like to tell about the island that we are on. We call it the Nameless Island. That's a picture of the bathing scene at Pablo Beach, Florida. Bathing apparently was what they used to call swimming, or just standing beside the ocean. But so you probably heard that our island doesn't really have a name other than the Jacksonville Beach's island. You have likely also heard the name Pablo or San Pablo attached to us in some way. There's been a proposal to name the island San Pablo Island. First I want to talk about why we don't have a name for this island. Second, just how far back the San Pablo thing goes. So there's a good reason that the island doesn't have a name. It's because it didn't used to be an island. It's something that I think is underknown now, but while it functions very much like a barrier island in a similar way to Cumberland or Anastasia Island, it was actually connected to the land at Palm Valley with about a 10-mile span. In 1912, they dug a canal connecting the San Pablo Creek to the north to the Talamato Creek to the south, making a navigable waterway for the first time, turning it into an island. That was the birth of the Intercoastal Waterway in Northeast Florida. It's now obviously been greatly expanded, but that's also what turned our beaches island into an island. So later on, folks, late 20th century is when I first remember hearing about it. People said, well, we don't have a name, we got to name it one. And one that keeps coming up is San Pablo Island. It's a name that has a ton of history here. I think you'd be hard pressed to find a name that has a stronger connection to the place that we are than this. It goes back, just like some text wrapping issues there. But what it says was, as a lot of you likely know, Jacksonville Beach's former name from the 1880s to 1922 was Pablo Beach. It was changed to Jacksonville Beach to celebrate the close connection that it had with the bigger city. But that name itself has an even more remote history. In the early 1800s, all of the beach's island, or most of it, the northern part, was part of a massive slave plantation. It was owned by this guy, and this is a very rudimentary view of how much land this guy owned. That's the bulk of the island. His name is Bartolome de Castro y Ferrer, and he owned this massive plantation whose name was San Pablo. But the name didn't begin there. He got the name from the creek. It was the logical thing to call it, being based on San Pablo Creek. San Pablo Creek, as you likely know, is the northern part of the Intracoastal Waterway that touches the island. It's it runs out as a tributary of the St. Johns River. That name goes back even farther than that. That name goes all the way back to the 1600s. It goes all the way back to the colonial period we were just talking about. There was a Mocama Temuco town on the creek, not on our side of the creek, but on the other side of the ditch, who the Spanish referred to as San Pablo. And it's not known what the Temuco name was for this town, if it was on Spanish records, just call it San Pablo. It was a small town that was connected to some of the other towns, all within the Spanish mission system. So the name San Pablo goes back, how many years is that? 400 years? It's 400 years old name. I don't know that we're ever going to find anything that is older than that. So my vote is, if we're going to name the island, let's just stick with that. This thing's really trying me here. Okay, so our next story. Clearly, I love ghost stories. I started off with one. We're going to do another one here. This is one that I bet a lot of people in the room are familiar with. How many of y'all are familiar with the ghost of Taco Luke? Good number of you. Former homestead ghost. Are any of y'all familiar with the name Alpha Painter? A few of y'all. Well, Alpha is a pretty incredible person. She's said to be the ghost that still inhabits the place. Alpha Painter was a prominent beaches businesswoman from the 1930s to her death in 1962. She, although she was very prominent in a number of businesses, some of which many of y'all are still familiar with, even today, long after she died, parts of her life are a mystery. It's not known what her maiden name was. It's not known exactly where she came from. And to my knowledge, nobody's ever found a picture of her. But still, from 1930 until her death, she was a big-time restaurateur in our area. She came to Jax Beach in 1930 after divorcing her husband. She came out here, she never married again, and she found a ton of success, an unusual amount of success for a divorced woman in that period. Her first restaurant was the Copper Kettle. It was down at the end of Atlantic Boulevard, where I believe was it One Ocean, former sea turtle restaurant. Used to be, that was her first restaurant, and that was a big hit. She used the proceeds that she earned from that to start another business. This is the more famous one, not too far from where we are actually, across the street, the Homestead. So she built this old cottage-looking log cabin vernacular house. Originally, it wasn't a restaurant. Originally, it was a boarding house. It was a place where you could stay, like kind of like a longer-term hotel, where she also cooked food. Well, her food became so famous, it was family-style, old-school Southern cooking. It became so famous that it soon took over any money that she was possibly making at a boarding house, so she converted it into a full-time restaurant in 1947. She maintained it for another several years. She sold it in 1961, and she passed away in 1962. The homestead continued, however, with varying amounts of changes, not a ton of changes to the architecture for the next 50 years. And after she died, the rumor started pretty quickly that she might have died, but she never actually left. This is another one that I heard growing up. Everybody I knew, I hung out with a lot of weirdos who also like ghost stories, like myself. But it was one that was definitely prominent by the 1980s. I heard that as far back as the mid-60s that it already was in place. I'm not sure if it was immediately said to have been Alfred Painter's ghost, but that's definitely who it's said to be now. So there's a couple of reasons why it has accrued this ghost story. One is the way it looks. Let's look at that. It just looks haunted. And that's it's a nice paint job. They do a good job with it. But it's this old-timey log cabin vernacular building. It just looks like it would be haunted. On the inside, it looks even more haunted than on the outside. The other is that the restaurant was around for so long and so beloved by Fiji's folks for so many years that everybody knew where it was. And that gave the staff that worked there the chance to carefully cultivate and remember and share the stories. The story about Alpha is really a positive ghost story as far as those go. She's said to be a benevolent ghost that's just checking in on her restaurant. She's usually spotted by the fireplace, sometimes in the bathroom or by the stairs leading up to the second floor. She's mostly said to be a friendly ghost. Since Taco Lu took over in 2011, after the homestead finally shut down for the final time, it had gone through something like 5 or 6 different owners over the years. Taco Lu took over, they were committed to maintaining the look of the architecture while also changing up the decor, the more Tex-Mex flair, and it's got some cool murals on it. But I think they've done a good job, and their staff today, if you go there now, they're just as likely as they were back in the 80s and 90s to share the ghost stories with you and be able to point out other people that claim to have seen the ghost. So next up, this is called Secret Jacksonville, and I mostly focus on things that are lesser known, a little bit kind of off the radar. But one thing that I like to do with the book was take places that are extremely well known, that have some kind of a hidden secret feature or story or importance in history. So the Jacksonville Beach Pier is clearly something I'm sure every person in here. How many of y'all have seen or been to the pier? Yeah, virtually everybody. But what you may not know is something that I'm not sure has gotten the traction that it really deserves, is the role that the pier played in surfing taking off as a major sport around the Jacksonville area. Before we get into that, I'll tell you a little bit about the piers, the history of it, how it got to be what it is now, how it played a role in the development of local surfing. The piers have been here ever since the early 20th century. There was a pier at 2nd Avenue North. It was built in 1922. In those days, it wasn't just a pier, it was a place for fishing and dancing, of all things. Yeah, dancing was a big deal on the pier. At that time, Jack's Beach was growing into a kind of a small scale tourist attraction amusement park. There was a roller coaster, there was a Ferris wheel, there were all sorts of carny games and everything happening right in the middle of downtown. The pier played a big part of that. But by 1962, the pier and all of that other stuff was starting to age. The thing is, the pier is made out of wood, it's out in the middle of the ocean. There's a reason that you hear about like the Great Wall of China and Roman buildings. You don't hear about Roman or Chinese ancient piers. That's because they have to be constantly maintained and upgraded over the years. That's exactly what was happening there. Well, there was a conflict in the Jack's Beach City Council at the time. Some of the people said, well, the pier is a great resource, it's a great asset, we wouldn't want to lose it, we need to commit the funding to fix it up or build a new one. That was about half the council. The other half said, we don't need the pier, it's attracting a bad element, which in those days meant teenagers and sailors. These were obviously the bad guys in the, in the 80s dancing movie. No, we can't have that pier, but their goal was to just tear the thing down and tear down the rest of the amusements and rebuild a more wholesome environment. While the city council was debating that, the pier mysteriously caught fire and burned down. So, who knows exactly what happened with that, but the city almost went without a pier at all because there was no way now that there was going to be a compromise. The pier had to be demolished and not everybody was going to contribute money. Jack's Beach almost went without a pier, except for one man, R.L. Williams, decided to privately build one on 6th Street South, 6th Avenue South, several blocks south of downtown. And so he built a pier, and this is the one that really has a place in history, as it played a major role in the birth of surfing here. Now, there were some surfing. I've heard stories as far back as the 1930s that some people were surfing. A few people, particularly up by Mayport, that early. But as late as 1962, incredible as it seems today, as late as 1962, there were only a handful of regular surfers in all of the Jacksonville area. It was the same 6 or 8 kids going out on the weekends. Now when there's good waves, you can barely see the ocean, how many surfers are there. But it wasn't always like that. The 1963 pier really changed the game for local surfing in a number of ways. One, even more so than the previous pier, it created excellent breaks that were surfable at pretty much any time there were waves. One thing, if you know about surfing, one thing that kind of sucks about it is at high tide, a lot of the breaks are covered up, the waves don't break there. So you're not able to surf at times of high tide. Well, at the pier, as long as there's waves coming, you're able to surf pretty much anytime you want. It also created a place for surfers to hang out, see and be seen, to show off what they were doing, to make new converts, and to flex on each other and get better and better at the sport. With that little community that was starting to grow up in 1964, something pretty amazing happened. And that was the Endless Summer Road Show. Documentarian Bruce Brown had gone around the world with a surfer named Robert August and filmed their adventures trying to find the best beaches and the best waves and documenting it. It was the first high-profile surfer movie. It didn't get a good distribution deal because surfing, the distributors all thought surfing was too much of a niche thing. Bruce Brown had a different idea, so he said, well, if they're not going to distribute it, I'll just do it. So he went all over the country. He tried to pick towns where he thought that there would be interest in what he was doing. And one of the towns that he picked was Jacksonville Beach. He heard about the pier and the small group of surfers that were hanging out there. And so he brought his road show to town. 1964 is pretty awesome. It's hilarious to read the newspaper articles from around that time. People just talk about being mobbed. Like thousands of teenagers came out to the pier to see the pro surfers, the high-profile surfers that had come on the road show, doing tricks and showing off stunts, and really elevating the game. So thousands of kids came out to see this, and then later that night they played the movie. And essentially the entire beaches was cooked after that point. Surfing went from being something that was a very small niche sport. I mean, probably, I can't even think of something that would be similar to that now. Pickleball, I don't know. So almost overnight, being an activity that you can't go out to the beach anytime that there's waves, and you won't see people out there surfing. So I like to say that it drew thousands, and it created a surfing fever that still hasn't broken to this day, even 50 years later. And it wouldn't have happened it wasn't for that pier being built. The current pier is different than that one. The previous pier on 6th Avenue South was damaged in Hurricane Floyd. The city of Jacksonville actually built the new one. And it's the one that is at 5th Avenue North. It's closer to where the old historic pier was located. And this one's an even bigger attraction. It's more centrally located. It's got better parking, and it's just the surfing scene around here has just grown so much that it's a huge deal. Unfortunately, it was damaged in hurricanes, and it's currently under construction. Hopefully, they will wrap that up soon, and we'll get our pier back. Our next story, we're going to kind of start to veer outside the beach into a more wider area of discussion, talking about our local shrimping and fishing industry. Now, even if you don't like seafood, you're probably aware that seafood is a big deal around here. Now, what I don't think we give ourselves enough credit for is that our region is the birthplace of modern shrimping as we know it. Not just a big industry here. We are the birthplace of the way modern shrimping is done. It actually starts not in Mayport, but in Fernandina, just to the north of us, where local shrimpers made a number of innovations that set the industry standard that's still used today. Historically, to catch shrimp, you had to go out of rowboats and you would hang what's known as a seam net between them, and you try to catch shrimp that way. Being in rowboats, you can't go very far out, so you stayed in more of the near shore waters. Well, in 1903, at Fernandina Beach, fishermen named Soyacito Salvador did something that nobody else was thought to try before. Apparently, anywhere that shrimp are seriously caught, he bought a motorboat and decided to go out and see what he could get. He was tired of fighting for space in the near shore areas. And so he went and he said to the motorboat, I can go farther out and see what I can catch. Well, he went and when he got out into deeper water, he found that the waters out there are even more abundant than the ones nearer to the water. He discovered one of the most fertile shrimp fisheries in the entire world. And it's really just kind of a trick of geography. The St. John's River is a major breeding ground for shrimp and kind of a safe place for them to grow. And then they go out into the ocean. And north of that is Fernandina, south of that is St. Augustine. Carried around in the warm waters of the Gulf Stream, they just flourish out there. And so Soyacito Salvador was the one who discovered it. But that wasn't it. In 1912, a New England fisherman named Billy Corkum, who would come down south, decided to use a new type of net, originally hoping to catch fish. This net is called an otter trawl, and the way that it works is you drag it behind the boat. It has kind of a frame that holds a mouth open, and as it drags, fish and shrimp and whatever else gets pulled into the net. He originally was hoping to catch fish with it, but once he got out of Fernandina and got far enough out, he discovered how great it was at shrimp. So he made some modifications. And those modifications created the very same shrimping otter trawl that is still the industry standard today. So all of those shrimp boats that you see, either here or anywhere else, are using that innovation. Now, Mayport was very quick to catch on. Mayport was historically already a fishing village, so they had a lot of knowledge. And as soon as they saw how much money there was to be made in what was called for a brief period of time pink gold, that's shrimp, by the way. They jumped on board. Mayport gives its name to Mayport shrimp. It's something that's very popular around here now. If you're a foodie, real shrimp scholar, you know that Mayport shrimp doesn't mean it is actually shrimp from Mayport. It means that it's shrimp from pretty much anywhere in the southeast that are offloaded at Mayport, and these days just somewhere in the Jacksonville, Fernandina area. But what it does mean, it does have a real meaning. Even if it's not has a real meaning. That is to say that this shrimp comes from here. It's not that the frozen farm-raised garbage you can buy at Publix. It smells like trash and tastes even worse. Mayport shrimp is when you've got the real good stuff. And any place that has that and is selling it and is telling the truth about it, you know that that's a safe place for you to be able to get your shrimp fixed. All right, I think we have time for the last couple of stories. This is one of my favorite stories of all time, anywhere in the Jacksonville area. This involves a mystery house and a bizarre object and potentially aliens. This is the story of the mysterious Beth Spear of Fort George Island. Now, out in the woods of Fort George Island, pretty hidden off the beaten path, you can find what is left of an unusual Tudor Revival style home. It's out there not far from the Kingsley Plantation and the Revoke Club. It's not marked, and it has to be, it's very difficult to find, but it can be found. I'm living through. I made it out there. I took that picture. Not only that, but when I went out there, I met another couple randomly walking in the woods. We all went and discovered it together, which sounds like the start of a horror movie. But the house can be found off the beaten path, and it's a pretty eerie sight to be walking through the woods, going down what looks like just a trail, and then ultimately coming to this. The house has a pretty creepy origin. It was built in 1927 by local architects for a Chicago businessman by the name of Nettleton Neff. Nettleton Neff intended to make it his summer home, but the family was hit by a series of tragedies. Neff's wife died in a house fire. His son committed suicide, and later Neff took his own life as well before any of them ever got to live in the house. So it changed owners a number of times over the years. Fort George Island never saw a ton of development, so it was still out there. By the 1970s, it was in the hands of the Betts family, Jerry and Antoine Betts. 1974, Jerry and Antoine Betts were walking in the woods around their property after a forest fire had happened. They were surveying the damage with their son Terry, a medical student. I was back from college visiting. And while they were looking around, Terry made a pretty unusual discovery. He found a metallic sphere about the size of a basketball. And he couldn't figure out any origin for it, where it had come from. He thought it was an odd enough thing to take home as a souvenir. Well, at home, he started reporting that it started displaying bizarre properties. And he said that when he played his electric guitar near it, it would hum back to the notes. He said that when you set it on the floor of the house, it would start to roll around in odd patterns, seemingly on its own volition. And it was even said to emit a high-pitched noise that humans couldn't hear, but would drive dogs crazy. Which, if you own dogs, like that's even worse. Well, the sphere pretty immediately, they started asking around for help identifying what the hell the thing was. First up was the host of a local radio show that specialized in the paranormal. The host of the show came by and saw it. He confirmed that it did all of these things. And of course, Steve thought it was absolutely 100% aliens. Next up, the Navy investigated the sphere because there was some speculation that it was some kind of top secret technology. Jerry Betts, being a very astute businesswoman, wrote up a contract where she told the Navy that they could examine it, but they only had 2 weeks to look at it, and they had to at least tell her if it was government property, and if it was not, it had to be returned to her within 2 weeks. So the Navy, incredibly, signed on to this. They took the sphere away, but they were only able to find that it was not government property, and that it was absolutely made on Earth. But of course they would say that. Another theory is that it was just the check valve stopper from the local paper mill, but you know, they'll ignore that one. At any rate, the sphere had drawn so much attention. The Betzes were getting dozens of phone calls every day. They eventually just got sick of talking about it, and so they just didn't. They just stopped talking about it entirely. To this day, no one knows what became of the sphere, where it is. It's assumed that the family still has it, or at least knows its location, but nobody really knows where it came from. And you often will find this story in accounts of paranormal, paranormal activities, but there's no new information. Nobody has talked to the Betz family. I will say that my partners at WJCT, local NPR station, 3 years ago, they did an excellent podcast that is by far the most complete account of what is known about the Betz sphere. It's called Oddball. It's a podcast. You should check it out. It's really cool. And then I'm going to close out with this final story on one of my favorite places. We're going to get even farther away from the beach now, pretty much as far as you can go and still be in Duval County. Bulls Bay Preserve and Waterfall. Looking at that picture, yes, that is in fact a waterfall, and it is right here in Jacksonville. Now, it's Florida, so it's not much of a waterfall. It's about 4 feet tall, but still, it's really cool. You don't see that every day in Florida. Now, Bulls Bay Preserve is a bit of parkland off Old Plank Road, way out on the west side. It is a 1,200 acre parcel. It has history that goes all the way back to the beginning of the city, pretty incredibly. It was a swamp. It's now known as Bulls Bay Swamp, but it was in the early 1800s, the official slave plantation of Isaiah D. Hart, who was the founder of Jacksonville. He's the one who owned most of the land where downtown Jacksonville is now, and decided to make a good spot for a town. So he ceded away much of his property there and formed the original town of Jacksonville. Well, Paradise Plantation, 10 miles to the west, out in the swamp, was his plantation. The area at that time wasn't known as Bulls Bay Swamp, it was known as the Cracker Swamp. After the prime inhabitants of the area, the poor white landless farmers, known as Florida Crackers. If you've gone to the bathroom here, you've seen a example of cracker architecture. But it was called the Cracker Swamp. After the Civil War, Isaiah D. Hart's son, Ocean Hart, who's depicted there, and later became governor of Florida, he disposed of the old plantation, and it was divided up, although it didn't see a ton of development. It was encroached upon on the different edges. Marietta developed out there, but it didn't see a ton of activity. Another note is nobody knows why it's called Bulls Bay Swamp today. It's one of those unknown mysteries of Jacksonville. Now, it saw some use for logging and sand mining, and some development of kind of the outer edges. It went from about a 2,000 acre swamp to about a 1,200 acre swamp, but mostly the core swamp wasn't developed. In the 1990s, it was seen that the Bulls Bay Swamp was a prime area for preservation because it is the headwaters of two major tributaries of the St. Johns River, the 6 Mile Creek and the Cedar River. And so pollution that happens there also happens in the St. Johns River, so there was a huge effort to save it. The St. Johns Water Management District put restrictions on it, and in 1999, the city of Jacksonville, under my father, John Delaney, he was mayor at the time, launched a preservation project where they assembled vast swaths of land, hoping to preserve it for the future. Bulls Bay was one of them. The intention at that time was to build a park there, turn it into a park, that had trails to open it up. The old Baldwin to Jacksonville Rail Trail goes through the northern edge of the Bulls Bay Swamp, but there was a conflict between the city and the Water Management District. city said they wanted to build a park. Water management district said, well, you can't build a park without taking fire precautions, clearing out underbrush. And the city said, okay, we'll do that. And the water management district said, no, you can't do that either. It became a whole thing. It went back and forth. And so for 20 years, it just sat out there. It sat out there as preserved land, which it was serving its main purpose, but it wasn't turned into a park. Now, I have heard, of course, that the local teenagers knew all about this place. It's where they used to sneak off and drink beer and do teenager things. But it wasn't until 2019 that the city very quietly struck a deal where they could develop small parts of the property for parks. And so they cut trails, including a trail that goes where you can see this, about a quarter of a mile into the woods, and one small fraction of the Bulls Bay Park. And I love this story because this is something, I've lived here my whole life. I spend a great deal of my time, both professionally and recreationally, researching interesting and unusual and hidden things about Jacksonville, and I had no idea that existed. Literally until someone on Facebook sent me a video of the waterfall, and I had no idea that it was there. And when he sent me the waterfall, I'm like, oh, it's Bulls Bay Preserve. You know, I look into it, it turns out that my father is the one that preserved this area. So I called him up, I said, hey, Dad, how did you not tell me there's a waterfall out of that Bay Preserve? And he responds, there's a waterfall in Bulls Bay Preserve? He's the one that preserved the land, and he didn't even remember that it was there. And so today, it's now open. Anybody can get out there. It's a pretty easy walk out into the woods. I'm a big evangelist for this place. I think it's one of the coolest things to see in all of Jacksonville. And I think it has a great history story. I highly encourage anybody that has the ability to get out there to do it if you can. So that concludes our presentation for today. Spent any time with us tonight. I had a great time. I hope that you all enjoyed it too.
Thank you so much. I want to make a few comments, and then if anybody has any questions, would you be willing to?
Absolutely.
Before you go outside a bunch more bits. So just a few comments from me as I sit here monitoring the Zoom. The irony of the pier being kind of the birthplace of our local surfing culture is that the fishermen fishing off the pier, I mean, it is like, they do not like each other. So it's kind of ironic that they're kind of interdependent. We found a picture of Alpha Painter in our archive. It was a big day. She was such a prominent businesswoman in our community. We did our women's history exhibit. Of course, we found a picture after we did our women's history exhibit, but we do have a picture of her, and we'll find it for you. Did she have children? She have children?
I don't believe she had any children. She had like nephews and nieces.
But I've been in the upstairs office at Taco Lou. It's definitely haunted. Hopefully you all have been inspired to go out and visit the Jacksonville waterfall. When you're out, you won't feel like you're in Jacksonville when you go out there, but it's definitely worth the trip. While you're there, while you're all the way out there on the other side of town, stop by Camp Milton. Camp Milton, it was like a Civil War encampment, and it's definitely worth the trip. There's some great trails out there too, and you will feel like you're on a little vacation outside it. Maybe not vacation, but you won't feel like you're in Jacksonville. Any questions?
Family that's got the ball, are they still here somewhere?
My understanding is that they don't live in Jacksonville anymore. Jerry Betts is still alive, and some of the sons are. In that podcast, they got Jerry Betts on the line. They almost got her to talk, but had to cancel it before, they were able to. So they are still around, and they're not spilling the beans.
She wants to give it to a museum. I mean,
I know.
Does your book have directions to these places?
It has the addresses for everything. Yeah, and it's virtually all of the stuff that you can see. There's a few things you can't see. The wreck of the Maple Leaf is in the middle of the river, so you won't be able to see that.
But the Mandarin Museum has a wonderful exhibit on the Maple Leaf.
What's the history of the term cracker?
The history of the term cracker is very interesting history, and most people will tell you that it comes from the sound of whips cracking. That apparently is not true. The term greatly, vastly predates the time period that Florida and Georgia crackers were doing cattle driving. The term originally meant a boastful person. You heard the term crack a joke or crack wise, wisecrack. That's the etymology of that. It was a boastful person that came to then be applied to rural bumpkins and then eventually to a specific social class of poor white farmers over time. Shakespeare uses the term cracker, so it didn't come from cattle driving. Question over there?
Bill, the items were found on that ship off the coast of Florida. Have they been rolled up and are they supposed to be seen?
Not yet. My understanding is that there's a dispute between the people that found it and the government of France. Government of France claims they're very clearly that they belong to France. And Sally was saying, no, this isn't a French ship. It just has a bunch of French stuff on it. But if France does own it, then there's a very good chance that they, usually when they find things in colonial areas, they allow it to be displayed in the area. So there's a great chance that if France does own it, that this is where it will be.
Does family still own that house?
The Best family does not own the house. The house was later transferred to Tobacco Preserve. So now it's just part of the wider preserve. They used it for offices for a while. Nowadays, it's just kind of looking super scary out in the middle of the woods.
Are there any other hills besides Hidden Hills and Windy?
Other hills? Well, I can tell you one hill, Billy Goat Hill in downtown Jacksonville. If you've ever gone and seen the Episcopal Cathedral, that is on top of a very, very small, almost an insult to call it. But at the time the church was built, it was the highest point in Jacksonville. And so, so there's a couple of hills.
Who lived in the house that you were raised in?
My parents still live there. Yeah, they still live there. They've had it since the 1940s sometime. My mom has lived there since, the early 60s. Pretty much unbroken.
Wow. The Nazi submarine make it into your book, or is that too well known?
Yeah, I didn't make it into the book. It was one that was on my long list. That's the hardest part of writing this book was coming up with a big list of all the stuff I wanted to include, and then having to only be able to include 86 things. And so it was one that didn't make a cut. It is a great story, though. If there's a volume 2, that will be.
You can learn all about it at Beaches Museum though.
Yes, learn about it at the Beach Museum. It's a great, very interesting story. How much is the book? It's $24.19. Take cash, credit, Venmo, pretty much any sort of payment. Do we have any more questions? I think we're good.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you all.